Okay, welcome once again. My name is Mark Renz. Welcome to another one of the WIGL Summit meetings. This meeting is going to focus on herbicide use to control woody invasive species. We have some really great speakers here to talk to you about tools and options that can be used. Obviously, this session is sponsored by WIGL, which is a project. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Stephen Enloe, who comes to us from Florida. He's going to give two of our first sets of presentations, with the first one focusing on choosing the right application method for woody invasive plants. Again, a reminder, if you have questions, type it into the Q&A box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Stephen, take it away.
Thank you, Mark. Can you see my first PowerPoint slide?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent. Okay, good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here with you. I wish I could do it in person, but we work with what we got and pandemics. So today, we're going to start off. We're not quite to this point. This is kind of our fantasy of sending a fleet of drones out to nuke all our invasive plant problems. But we're working in this direction. We saw some really good data this morning on the use of fire from our colleague at Connecticut there, which was great. But what I want to do is give you two goals, really, to talk about factors going into application method selection for herbicides, and then get into several key herbicides and points that really help you think about it, selecting the right herbicide for the job. Okay, so look, any trade names I throw out this morning, UF's not endorsing them, but honestly, within our world, trade names have become part of the herbicide lingo. And so if I switch up triclopiramine with Garlon 3A, I'm not endorsing that product, but it is what it is. So when we think about woody plant control methods, we have foliar type issues, from broadcast methods down to spray guns and backpacks, and then following that into our other IPT methods of basal bark, cut stump, hack, and squirt. For the sake of time today, I'm going to focus in on these lower methods there. I really am not going to get into the aerial stuff today or the really big broadcast stuff. But I find with the audience here that a lot of the work that goes on is going to be in those bottom categories anyway. So we're going to get into these. Now, this is not a technical deep dive on these things. Now, we do those seminars at the University of Florida Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. And I've given some of those at other seminars around the country. And if you're interested in really technical deep dives on these specific techniques, reach out to me and we can set up a meeting to help you go through these. But today, I want to challenge you to think about some things. Okay, so when you think about woody plant anatomy, really, we're trying to get the herbicide to some very specific places within woody plants, primarily into the inner bark, which we call the phloem, and just within that layer, the cambial layer, that meristematic zone that divides, producing new phloem to the outside and new sapwood or xylem, cell xylem to the inside. Okay, so depending upon our application methodology, we may be doing a foliar treatment that gets those herbicide into the leaves and then gets those into the translocating tissue, the phloem itself, directly loading from the leaves. Or we do a basal bark application where we're pushing, getting that herbicide through the outer bark, getting it to penetrate, using an oil, getting it into the phloem and the cambium. Or we're doing a hack and squirt injection type approach where we make an incision into the tree that literally reaches the sapwood, creating a cup that we are eventually going to pool the herbicide directly across the cambium and the inner phloem. Okay, so we know that timing of year also influences this in terms of sap flow, and when sap flow is moving upwards, often in the late winter, early spring, we literally can see a very poor control with herbicides in general. We often talk about seasonality of later summer, fall, early fall treatments where sap flow is downwards for energy storage being a fantastic time. Now, we recognize you can't move all your treatments to that point, so we got to just be able to work many more months of the year. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to tell you is you may need to question some legacy approaches to method selection. We do see a lot of turnover within the invasive plant management world, especially among agencies, state agencies, and even federal agencies. And I like to say that the most dangerous phrase in invasive plant language is we've always done it this way. So I strongly encourage you to get with the science and figure out what is innovating, what is changing, what is moving forward. And you being at this meeting shows you want to do that, and that's a good thing. So when we think about factors that you are really wrestling with, For application methods, clearly target species are coming into play, the available equipment you have, application logistics, and of course, public safety. I like to throw that out there. The second talk I'll get into, of course, is on herbicides. So when we think about target species, you've got a suite of trees within the WIGL collaborative, and I love your acronym, by the way. I think it's fantastic. But we've got some real players here, our poster child of Ailanthus altissima, of course, but then a number of other species, Pyrus caloriana and Robinia being two other beasts that a lot of folks really wrestle with. We've got a series of woody vines here, everything from ground cover forming vines all the way to massive, massive tree and wrapping vines. And then finally, a number of shrubs, that break down to the Loniceras, the Elaeagnus, and of course the buckthorn collective there, and then a few others with multiple rose and lineberry. So you've got your work cut out for you here. There's no question. This is a who's who of troublemakers, each coming with a lot of different biological characteristics. I can't cover all of those. There will be opportunities to try to get some species-specific questions involved, but answered at the end. But we've got to keep moving forward here. So some things to think about, and we'll go through each of these, from whether you're going after single or multiple species, whether they have thorns, target sizes, densities, single multi-stemmed individuals, and of course lateral root and basal sprouting, and then some special vine issues. So this is a southeastern suite of species, but it gives the concept of, we deal with a lot of species, and in some situations we will be going after multiple species that may be everything from herbaceous all the way to woodies. Aquatics may be involved, wetland situations may be involved. And when we get into training our crews to address multi-species complexes, it can be a bit of a different mentality. Search images and search functions become more complex with the more species you're going after. It's often easy for applicators. There's a higher probability of misses the more species they're searching for. And so oftentimes we do simplify it down, and we can focus a lot of our work on single species layers, such as we have here in terms of buckthorn. So when we come back to this, we often think about herbicides from some sort of tank mix prescription that's going to be encompassing a control for a very diverse set of species with a foliar treatment. That is often going to inevitably reduce selectivity, unfortunately, and we do this in roadside right-of-way situations frequently. In natural areas, we really often are focusing on maintaining diversity and protecting species, and it makes it much more challenging the greater the complex of species. So we do a little bit better when we are dialed in on single species, and that's really our best option typically for the most selective type approaches. I mentioned the thorny issue, and you've got a handful of species from multiflora rose and lineberry there to of course the buckthorns, to the barberry, and of course our nasty one here, calorie pear in the middle, that has these nasty spur shoots. I say it's a thorny issue because I have been on invasive plant jobs and volunteer pulls where I've seen some gruesome eye injuries associated with thorny plants. I cannot stress to you enough crew safety when it comes to addressing any of these species, and utilizing techniques that are going to keep your applicators out of harm's way with these types of species as much as is physically possible. I always recommend eye protection no matter what. Working in the woods doesn't matter what you're going after, but with these species, the wraparound eye protection, I believe, is absolutely critical. And I also really encourage people to focus on using the techniques. Use foliar where you can to avoid having to get down and get your face down into these spiny, thorny canopies as much as possible. In very dense infestations, that may require getting mechanical assist mulching machines to come in, open up trails, open up paths to get through to do subsequent control type strategies. But don't underestimate the issues that these species can have in terms of worker safety. Target size is always a big one. Here's a range of Norway maple, everything from less than 2 inches to right under 4-inch diameter. DBH tree, about a 6-inch, and then somewhere upwards of 10 inches there. And oftentimes we're sort of wrestling and addressing multiple size species. We often think about utilizing basal bark applications on anything, less than 2 inches, of course, even less than 4, and sometimes into that 4 to 6 inch range, depending on species. Bigger than that, we often either go to a cut stump, cutting the whole tree down, or a hack and squirt type approach. We don't always work in even age silviculture where everything is completely uniform. In the world of invasives, though, we do often find recruitment that gives us very even age stands that we're dealing with. And that can help simplify management. Whereas in this case, you've kind of got a little bit of everything out there to deal with. Of course, with size, bark thickness comes in, especially for our basal bark applications, where smooth, thin bark is definitely easier to penetrate with our basal oils. And the older the trees and that rigid, platy bark becomes tougher to penetrate. We often see a transition in species as they go into that 4 to 6 inch DBH range, where they start to get iffy on basal bark. The good news is with a lot of invasives, they can be very smooth skinned. And we can be very successful with basal bark applications, oftentimes much greater than 6 inches DBH. Some general guidelines on target height and density. This is a very old diagram that I got from a colleague named Bill Klein, who used to be with WIGL Agriscience before retiring. But the point here is you have a woody plant density of stems per acre from 500 upwards of 3,000, and woody plant height on the x-axis here. You can generally see where backpack and directed foliar works on stuff that is not over your head or just that you can reach with a backpack sprayer. And that's generally in this height range. You can also see that we sort of can go up to 1,000 stems per acre or so. And basal bark, we are often moving over here where we have stuff that's too tall to foliar spray, but not a typical density max of around 1,500 or so stems per acre. Above that, we often strongly encourage broadcast treatments, either or handgun, boom type powered sprayers, because it is just not possible to operate and successfully put these treatments out in these high density situations, especially with vigor. Now, where do cut stump and hack and squirt fit into that? Cut stump is like, it's the thing that we're often forced to do. This is the most expensive, most labor intensive, and oftentimes can be quite hazardous and difficult to deal with, where we are physically cutting the trees down to the ground here and then treating the stumps. But we use it. We use it where dead standing cannot be tolerated. We often use it to clean up sites, to remove tremendous amounts of woody biomass from a site. And so it is necessary. But it's one that I try to avoid as much as possible for the sheer labor that goes into it, which drives your costs way up. I would rather mulch a site down and then retreat the regrowth if possible than to go to full-on cut stump type treatments. Hack and squirt, of course, often using it for bigger trees. You're going to hear Jason Belcher talk a little bit about drill and fill and opportunities for that. And the world of hack and squirt continues to change as we get into reduced hack and squirt approaches that are no longer requiring continuous hacks all the way around woody stems or frill girdle type treatments, and that we're getting down to single hacks per stems, possibly as big as 4 to 6 inches in diameter in some cases. High densities that many of you will face on areas, they really can prevent effective control with some of the IPT approaches. And again, as I mentioned, you're running into just applicator difficulty to navigate through these stands. You've got thorny species, and you are pushing your labels on maximum herbicide labeled use rate. This is another thing we run into is multi-stem patterns create additional challenges. And here you can see 6 different stem patterns that are exceedingly common among our woody species. I'm not going to name all these, but you can see everything from single-stemmed, swollen root collars, branching several inches above the ground line, branching just above the ground line, branching at ground line in multiple fashions with lots of different types of sprouting. These types of things can lead to these very complex architectures that can result in massive bark inclusions. And where bark grows together like this can result in difficulties in control, which is why you see that I've cut stump treated this entire thing and around every single possible area there where bark inclusions may exist. So it's very important to consider that and recognize that multi-stemmed individuals are always much more challenging for both basal application, for hack and squirt, of course, and for cut stump. Now, we like to tout basal as being a great way to go here. Single stem type approach. This is everybody's dream, putting a 12-inch band of typically a triclopyr product in oil around the base of that. But this is reality. This is what we face. And here you've got multiple stems coming off this individual. You've got the small whippet type stems all the way to things that are 4 to 6 inches in diameter. Our application volumes go up substantially on a per unit basis here when we shift in dealing with these big trees on the right. And that's going to come into play on your ability to effectively do basal bark. Then we get into lateral root and basal sprouting for a number of species. This is Chinese privet, one that you don't, that is definitely coming your way if you don't have it yet. Across the southeast bad, but you can see lots and lots of sprouts coming off of lateral roots here. You can also see a lot of epicormic sprouts right around the base of this thing, or root collar sprouts, you name it. The greater the proclivity for a species to sprout like this, the more challenging it's going to be, and often the heavier hitter of a herbicide you're going to need. Tree of Heaven's a perfect example. This is literally all the ways it vegetatively sprouts, from lateral roots, which you know well, to sprouts coming off of more epicormic type sprouts off the sides of the stems, to adventitious buds at the cut surface, all the way to adventitious buds themselves coming at the axils, and then even stem sections, fragmentation that can present these, all of these. So we, among our woody species, we have a range of this, and we heard a great example of how Japanese barberry often is not having these deep sprouts, and that way the higher the elevated meristems are much more susceptible to a thermal event of a fire, so that we can get better control that way. So the bottom line is, though, the more of this you have going on, the harder it's going to be for single herbicide treatments to completely kill everything, and there's often inevitable root sprouting that occurs. Woody vines present their own challenges, no question. Of course, this is not one you're dealing with, but in a situation like this, vines can often girdle trees, causing substantial damage. Removing it off can be a hazard to the tree itself. As you chainsaw or hack this vine off, we can often cut into the bark of the non-target species there, and it's very important to very carefully work around these. There's a situation of English ivy of individual removal of all of those stems where it's growing into the bark, and the more a vine intimately associates within the bark of the tree, the more difficult it's going to be to remove. We do know that spraying 6, 7, 8 feet up and leaving the higher growth will not effectively kill vines, and they have to be cut for effective control. I like to recommend cut stump treatments. There's a tendency to want to basal bark these things, and you can do it in some situations, but depending upon the sensitivity of the tree the vine is growing up, we can run into trouble there. Equipment wise, there's a lot of different things that we're using out there. I'm not going to tell you exactly what to do here. For basal bark application, though, I like to get to the level of backpacks. I know a lot of agency folks will put it in smaller containers, even down to the squirt bottle level. But I like to get here for basal bark. For hack and squirt, I want to be here, but I want a squirt bottle that delivers a mill. You'll find that these bottles deliver 2 to 4 mils of volume, and that's not good for hack and squirt because it's going to be running out the sides of the hacks like crazy. These things I don't recommend it for hack and squirt because you can't control the volume well enough. Get rid of the plastic wand, get a good brass wand if possible. Keep your equipment sharp for your employees and applicators. I have run into so many crews with dull machetes and dull hatchets. Those are hazards. They are accidents waiting to happen. Same thing with chainsaws. Always make sharpening blades a critical component of any training you do. Some other aspects will be really area and terrain to cover. How big is the job? What access is available? What kind of terrain? You can see a couple of maps here. If you're dealing with a situation where you're sending backpack folks out into literally the backcountry, what are your logistics for them accessing water, for them pickup points, drop-off points? These can come into play. Crews carrying full backpacks across rough and difficult terrain is often a bit hazardous, where I love to try to get into as much hack and squirt to carry smaller squirt bottles that will effectively treat hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stems. But these are the things that you really need to be thinking about in considering, especially on sizes of jobs and reconning these things before taking a job. If you've got acres and acres and acres of a pure stand of an invasive shrub, you really need to think about how you're going to get in there, get to it, and exactly how your crews are going to handle that. Extreme slopes are, again, another major issue. I've seen folks fall down hillsides like this with backpack sprayers on, and it's really, really important to take these into consideration when you're treating on steep slopes. Of course, for crew safety, we have volunteers, we have seasonals like AmeriCorps folks, we have permanent crews. The one thing I would stress to all of these, when you engage them, teach them about monitoring and follow up in terms of the impacts of what they're doing. Everybody out here needs to learn exactly how effective it was what they did. Don't ruin your AmeriCorps folks by not showing them the successful impact, or where there's treatment failure by not taking them back and letting them see that. I know that can be difficult with seasonal type work, but if you want to gain allies in the invasive plant world for a lifetime, make sure that you are training them on understanding the impact of their approaches and how important that is. Public awareness, of course, being an issue. We talk about posting, but if a job is next to a popular running trail, I wouldn't be sending a crew out on a Saturday morning to be doing foliar treatments. Think carefully about the way you're going to approach that in extremely high public visibility areas. Finally, really dead standing. This is an issue. This was not from a herbicide treatment, just the dead standing trees in the forest where recently a hiker was killed by a dead standing tree. We really want to think about this carefully when we're using hack-and-squirt type treatments where we do leave dead standing, because we certainly don't want this linked back to an invasive plant type treatment. Okay, so bottom line is there's a lot to think about in terms of target species, available equipment, logistics, safety, and cost. Really take this into consideration. And I didn't get into a whole lot of costs because costs are literally a function of all of these types of things, and they're going to vary greatly. But the bottom line is when you start to put these types of things together, it gives you a more logistical plan that challenges the do it the way we've always done it mentality. Okay, so Mark, if you don't mind, I'll just move right on into the second part of the talk. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great, Stephen. I'll give you a chance when we pull up the second talk to take a deep breath. Stephen's going to talk now about choosing herbicides for woody invasives. Take it away, Stephen.
Okay, so we're now moving into a really, how to do herbicide selection and what are some of the factors. And I like to show fire pictures because I'm a pyromaniac, of course, like the rest of us. We like to burn things, but we train extensively when we use fire. And we do that to avoid this type of conflagrations. And I cannot underestimate how important it is that we train ourselves and get training on herbicides so that we can effectively conduct our herbicide applications as effectively as we conduct our prescribed fire. And we're getting better and better at burning all the time. And we need to have the same mentality when we're using herbicides in natural areas. Okay. So a lot of factors that are going to affect this, making sure it's labeled for the site and application technique. I'll occasionally get questions about horticultural herbicides and their use in natural non-crop areas. And a lot of times they're just not going to be labeled. Same thing goes for things moving into aquatic situations. Make sure you've got the right product with the right aquatic label, when working on emergent vegetation. The job is within maximum labeled rates per acre. You'll see how that comes into play here with some examples. Of course, applicator safety and of course, target efficacy. We want the herbicide to work. Non-target selectivity in natural areas is often critical. And again, costs, really some of the key factors that we have. So, in the world of invasive plants, for woody invasive plants, we don't have a huge deep toolbox. We've got a handful of things that we tend to use over and over and over. And if I were to poll you all, I would probably predict that 98% of you are pretty much right here in glyphosate triclopyr as being the two go-to herbicides for invasive plant control. Definitely moving into the world of aminopyrrolid for some, that's milestone. For woody legumes especially, picloram is an old school auxin type herbicide, been around for a long, long time. Not many people use it. It's more restricted use in a lot of cases. And imazapyr, a forestry herbicide that a lot of people, some have used, others have been shy of, especially in hardwood forest situations where residual activity can be problematic. And then the newer aminocyclopyrachlor method herbicide doesn't have a great reputation from its short stint as a turf herbicide in the northern tier states due to conifer damage, but it is a powerhouse of an herbicide in terms of woody invasive plant control. And it's definitely worth talking about. So we're going to go through several of these, what I have time for. We'll start with glyphosate. Glyphosate is on everybody's mind right now with 100,000 plus lawsuits and a huge Bayer settlement of over $10 billion. There's kind of a cloud over glyphosate. There's no question that it has caused a shadow to come across a lot of folks. And we've talked about the safety of glyphosate for years. And we're also dealing with the fact that over 150 US cities have banned glyphosate on public properties and public lands. So we've seen this all across the country as people have been very concerned about the health effects. So the reality is the IARC, which designated glyphosate as a probable carcinogen, not an actual carcinogen, is more or less disagrees with virtually every pesticide regulatory authority on the planet, from the EPA to the European Union and a number of other countries that have extensively and exhaustively reviewed glyphosate. So the EPA has reaffirmed the safety of glyphosate, saying it's not likely to cause cancer, and there's been no label changes at this point to the use of glyphosate products. And there's been no changes in statements of carcinogenicity, and the EPA has stood very firmly that the data does not support glyphosate as being even a probable carcinogen the way the IARC has done. So a lot of folks are now not using glyphosate, okay, and that's fine. I'm not here to tell you to use glyphosate, but some of the properties that make it, what has made it useful as a water-soluble herbicide, good for foliar treatments, very good for cut stump treatments at typically a 50% on a volume-to-volume basis, and good for hack-and-squirt type treatments at 50 to 100%. It is non-selective with no soil residual activity and very low cost these days. With aquatic formulations and a good maximum label rate of 120 in aquatics to 2 gallons on terrestrial, you got quite a bit of range there for foliar type treatments. Now you can push that max labeled use rate as you get into the high concentration spot treatments, and it's very important to remember that. Generally though, non-selective, but can provide very good activity on a whole lot of our troublesome species. Triclopyr is the second product, of course, or second active ingredient. We now have 4 formulations. If you didn't know this, we've got the classic amine formulation, which you know is the 3A, which is not a basal bark herbicide. It is water soluble and it is labeled for use in aquatics. We have the ester formulation, which is our old Garlon 4 type with generics. That is your oil soluble one, mixing with both oil and water for all kinds of treatments, but primarily for basal bark application with no aquatic label. We now have an acid formulation called Tricera that is labeled for basal bark, which can be mixed with both oil or water. It can also be used for foliar, for hack-and-squirt, for cut stump. That does have an aquatic label. And then we have the choline formulation, or Vaseline, not a basal bark herbicide. Yes, it's water soluble, and yes, it has an aquatic label. So instead of the confusion with 2 triclopyr products, now we've got 4, and the rules keep changing or have changed for these things. So they are selective, typically controlling woody broadleaf species with limited soil activity. I can't get away from no soil activity because I think triclopyr does have a little bit, and especially with more concentrated applications like basal bark, we can see some residual issues there for a short time. Again, we do have aquatic formulations for some, and they are cost dependent depending on the products, the cheaper ones being the 2 older products, the acid formulation being substantially higher, but having the benefit of being able to use it in aquatics, in terrestrial, for both basal bark applications and foliar applications all. Signal words are different among these new formulations. The Tricera has a danger signal word. So now you have a product you can use for basal bark that now has a danger. So no longer that caution signal word we use with the classic ester formulation for basal bark application. And the choline formulation, which is water soluble, has a warning, which can cause some eye issues. The 2 big ones, though, still being the acid formulation and the amine formulation, which if you get them in your eyes, they are corrosive. And if not washed out, can cause some definitely irreversible eye damage issues. This is exactly how to get herbicide in your eyes, and it's taking and working beyond the limits of your equipment. This is maxing out a backpack type application, and in the right wind current, that's all coming back in the applicator's face. I like to keep that wand head high or lower in all cases, and definitely be spraying downwind if there's any breeze at all. And it's really important to remember that, especially as you move into new triclopyr formulations that have higher signal words than you might be used to with Garlon 4. So when we talk about, I mentioned this label use rate issue, and this is really important because when we look at maximum labeled use rates here, you can see triclopyramine, that's the Garlon 3A, 3 gallons per acre, the ester 2 gallons, the choline now is at 2.25 gallons per acre. and the acid is at 3.15 gallons per acre. So the old rules of the 3.2 don't apply to these. You can see that they vary. And the problem is with the ester formulation, as we've known for years, you can really push the maximum labeled use rate with basal bark applications in high density shrub situations, bush honeysuckle, buckthorn, and other things where you really have those massive high multi-sprouting trunks that require quite a bit of volume for basal application. All right, so let me just give you some math here. At 2 gallons of product per acre, that gives you that much herbicide, and at 20% volume to volume, you've got 37,850 mils of herbicide oil mix. If you are putting out 5 mils of that herbicide oil mix per inch of root collar diameter, treat that in a 12-inch wide band, a 4-inch diameter tree is going to require 20 mils of that Garlon 4 oil mix. Divide that whole volume by 20 and you'll get about 1,892 trees per acre that you could treat that way at 4 inches diameter. This is why basal bark cuts off here around 1,500 stems, because we recognize that you go higher stem densities than that and you are going to violate that label. Now, this all changes when you get into these ridiculously ginormous type shrubs where you may have 20 or 30 stems coming off of these things. And if you have a total stem diameter of 30 inches on all these, suddenly you need 150 mils of mix. So that 1,700 trees comes down to 252 trees per acre like this. So the bottom line is we have to be careful when we are doing basal bark on high density woody shrub situations. Moving on to milestone and method for natural areas, these two definitely bring some things to the table that I want to quickly cover here. Aminopyrrolid milestone's been around for 15 years now, 2005. It's got a broad site use, but for our purposes, natural areas are not labeled for use in aquatics, but you can use it in seasonally dry wetlands and riparian areas when no water is present. That's clear on the label. You can use it to the water's edge, so that is clear on the label. Method from 2010, aminocyclopyrrochlor, again, primarily a non-crop herbicide. We've moved it into natural areas, not in aquatics, yes, in seasonally dry wetlands, and yes, to the water's edge. All right, the critical point is the label language allows for considerable use of these in natural areas. Use rates for both of these are exceedingly low, and a lot of people don't realize just how low these are. You're talking 3 to 7 ounces per acre of milestone, 4 to 18 on method. You can jack that to 14 ounces per acre if you're treating less than half an acre with milestone. But if you think about 40 gallon per acre backpack work, you're literally talking about putting 1.2 to 6 teaspoons per 3 gallon backpack. Who measures in teaspoons anymore, okay? We're talking about 2 to 10 mils per gallon of herbicide, all right? For method, just slightly more than that, of 2.6 to 13.2 mils per gallon in a lot of cases. All right, guess what? That's less herbicide than surfactant you're adding into the tank typically for a non-ionic at 1/4 to 0.5%. So the glug, glug, glug approach to mixing, it's absolutely critical you don't do this, okay? Get some syringes, get ways to measure this when you're doing backpack filling with either of these herbicides. You'll also see that there are lower concentrations for cut stump, basal bark, Hack-and-squirt. I don't like this basal bark issue for milestone at all. I know some folks add it to Tree of Heaven. Basal bark treatment's at a low concentration here. If it's working for you, great. I don't have a lot of data to support this, but if it's working fine, it's on the label. Method, again, lower concentrations of 5 to 10% with Hack-and-squirts of a 1/2 mil undiluted herbicide, 1 hack per 2 inches. I'm getting away with 1 hack per 4 inches for a lot of species in Florida. And there's a lot of work to be done there on a number of woody species in the north. So bottom line is maximum labeled use rates are going to come into play big time for these, especially if you're trying to do basal bark treatment or, again, high density woody stems per acre. All right, aminopyrrolid is really good on the Fabaceae. It also kills some trees in the Forbiaceae, like tallow tree in the southeast and Rosaceae, of course, with some good activity on multiple rows in the rubus. Additional herbaceous really hot across Asteraceae, Pliginaceae, Solanaceae, Rubiaceae, and just a few other species on the label. But there's a lot of good data on the selectivity of milestone out there. Method, much more general activity across many woody species. And I like to say this is an extremely powerful herbicide as an injection treatment. So across a lot of different woody species. But the bottom line is there's a lot of work on efficacy and injury needed for many, many northern woody species. All right. Problems can arise with both of these. It's not volatility. Drift can be an issue, and they both have some soil persistence. And they do have characteristics that are associated with mobility, with method being a little bit higher than milestone. So you put all three of these together, and this is where we can run into some issues for injury. With aminopyrrolid, it's often had to do more from a forage perspective of hay and manure. Getting into compost, the label is very clear about this. That's now a Corteva label, but the picture here is the same, where it can be exceedingly damaging to a lot of your vegetables within gardens especially. And of course, you know, aminocyclopyrrochlor is used to conifers in the north. That's really, you know, it's caused a lot of concern. And so I am not here to push this herbicide in the north. I'm just making you aware that it is out there, and it's something that we need to look at more closely for more species. Residual activity, the half-life is typically about 32 days for milestone. You can see for aminocyclopyrrochlor, it's much, much longer half-life, and that's where that persistence comes in. Compare that to imazapyr with a half-life of 24 to 142, and triclopyr averaging about 30 days also. So you can see difference-wise that aminocyclopyrrochlor is a lot more like imazapyr in terms of residual activity. Okay, so I didn't really get to imazapyr a lot. I think Jim Bean will talk about that a little bit, but I wanted to make sure I had some time for questions here, so I'm just going to wrap it up with that. So let me unshare the screen. Mark, we want to move into questions?
Yeah, great. We have like 3 or 4 minutes for questions. Thank you, Stephen, for a detailed response. We do have a couple questions, and I'm guessing some more will come in. I think this is a good one to discuss. I'm just going to read you the question. As someone who has worked mostly in private sector where our clients want the site clean, we almost always cut and treat and burn brush on site. So his question is when basal barking in mass, how do you deal with all those remaining standing dead vegetation? Or how long does it take to come down naturally? And does this have other limitations for the rate at which the system can heal when it's really dense?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. So now I'm going to give a little bit of non-northern perspective here. We attempt to integrate fire into a lot of these situations as much as possible, following treatments like that to deal with that dead standing. Things decompose a whole lot faster in the southeast oftentimes than they do in the north. And, you know, we can often see basal bark treatments that the woody brush stems are going down in 1 to 2 years. I suspect you can see stuff that will persist much longer than that. This does make it a much greater challenge for 2 reasons. One, for dealing with all that dead standing, and number 2, for the seedling recruitment that can often follow in a lot of those situations. That is where going to, you know, clearing, cut stump type treatments from the get-go and burning on site you can sort of give that perception of cleaning up the site. Your cost per acre is much higher initially in those situations for sure. But you know, if you can't get fire into the landscape to deal with those, and you can't wait for natural decay to occur, then going with cut stump may be the way to go, or going with mulching machines and following that up with foliar treatments to the resprouting that will inevitably occur. Mark, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think, you know, adding fire is always a benefit. It just depends. Ours are less fire adapted than you guys have down there.
Yeah,
so,
I get that.
We have less options, but I think we still do quite a bit of fire burning, particularly in our oak savannas. It really comes down to, you know, the objectives and who's going to be using the land. And so I would push that back. And then what's your budget? We have a lot of forestry mowers and a lot of people that are willing to go out and contract with forestry mowers. So one other quick question before we go on to our next speaker. This individual wanted to first thank you for focusing on safety, but didn't really understand what you meant by aquatic formulations available. So can you just clarify that?
Oh, absolutely. So in my world, water often comes into play in wetland areas. So we work in seasonally dry wetlands a lot here in Florida in the Southeast. And so when I say aquatic formulations, the EPA labels any aquatic product for use in water. And so a lot of invasives we deal with will both exist in the upland and higher parts of the system all the way down to the water's edge. And then we deal with some that tolerate, months of standing water. And we always recommend that you go to the aquatic product when you get down, below the high water mark for sure for a lot of situations. That's what I mean by EPA aquatically labeled formulation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. We appreciate it. I think we're going to go on to our next phase, but please stick around for the Q&A at the end.
Okay.
So now what we have is we have representatives from 3 companies. We have Jim Bean from BASF, Jason Belcher from Bayer, and Scott Flynn from Corteva Agriscience. And what we're hoping to do here is have a good discussion about some of these common techniques. And first, I think we'll have Jim start us off. If you can come up on the screen, Jim, and talk about he's gonna give an overview of low volume foliar applications, and he's then gonna also talk about some of the BASF products, and we'll in 10 minutes go on to the next presenter. Jim, if you want to take it away, go for it.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yep, looking good. I can hear you now and see you now.
Okay, am I on slideshow?
No, if you can push it again,
Okay,
that would be great.
It must have come off. Okay. All right. Well, I apologize. The pictures I'm going to show and things I'm going to talk about really have more of a right-of-way focus, but that's where most of my pictures come from. But all of these points can apply to an invasive weed situation in natural areas. In fact, do a lot of work there. So a low volume foliar application is really the reason people like to use them is it's low visibility. There's not a lot of herbicide that you're using. You don't use a lot of water. You can be highly selective. There's not a lot of equipment investment in these things. And you can get a really good production and reduce cost of all of the different techniques that Steve talked about when it comes to production and getting things treated in the right species composition, height, and density. This is going to be your most economical type of application. So from the perspective of when you would use this technique, and again, I'll go back to my utility right-of-way analogies. Generally, this is not your first attempt at controlling a lot of brush. If you have tall brush, dense brush, you're going to use some other technique, probably a higher volume foliar treatment. So this is going to be more of your secondary type treatments in an invasive weed situation in a natural area. Depending upon the species you're trying to control and the density is going to dictate whether or not you would use this or not. It's best in your lower density brush, and it's best in that smaller brush, like Steve said, generally no more than 6 feet tall. I define low volume applications as less than 50 gallons to the acre. If you're using things like an ATV, it could be 30 gallons to the acre. A lot of the utility right-of-way work that I work involved with is 5 to 15 GPA. So you're not carrying a lot of water when it comes to these types of techniques. So in those areas that are out in the back country, that's where this technique can help you. The beauty is you can use it in any terrain, any access, as long as you can walk to it. You can be very efficient. It's relatively low cost. And for my money, it's going to give you the best control of all of the different techniques. And you can have selectivity in that you are by placement, depending upon the products that you're using in the mix. So how do you do these applications? Most people associate this with backpacks, but you can use a truck with a tank and hose and handguns. You also can use ATVs, or you can use a tractor skidder in some situations. My preferred system for using backpack low volume foliar applications is a backpack, and then what's called a gun jet, which is a car wash gun. Actually, it's cut off on this picture. And then on that gun jet, you mount this rollover valve, and on one end you have a flat fan, and on the other hand you have an adjustable cone nozzle, and that gives you the best flexibility depending upon how wide the brush is, how tall the brush is, so that you can get the best kind of coverage. Now I represent BASF, and we make Arsenal herbicide, which is imazapyr, and imazapyr is similar to method in the sense that it is very, very active in a plant, translocates really, really well. And so you don't need complete coverage. Now this is, I'm spraying a pine tree here, and Arsenal obviously not going to control a pine tree, but the technique here is you make sure you get the top of that brush. You got to get the top of it, and then you want to get the growing points. If you're spraying something that's a little wider, you can use this Z-type pattern. And again, what you want to do if you had imazapyr in the tank is you want to get some droplets on about 70% of the leaves if it's a hardwood. Now, if you're spraying an area that's you have a crew, you can, and they do this on right away quite a bit, you spread out across the area, about an arm's length apart from each other, and then you just walk in a straight line, and then you spray everything that you come to, but you don't have to spray or you don't need to spray anything that obviously you're not trying to control. So that's where the selectivity in many cases can come from these techniques. So you want a product that will translocate really well. Arsenal is a wonderful product for these kinds of techniques, but again, in some natural areas with a lot of hardwood, it's not going to be the best product of choice. We make a product called Detail, which is really good on controlling conifers. So that might be a better option in some of your situations. So these are some brush mixes, and again, these are not primarily for native areas, but I just wanted to show you some of the kinds of mixes that are out there. So an Arsenal method escort Detail, that's going to take no prisoners. There's nothing going to come through that. But again, because you're using a selective application technique, you can be highly selective. A go-to mix would be something like an Arsenal Rodeo, or you could add some Milestone Escort to it. If you're looking for an aquatic mix, an Arsenal glyphosate mix can work really, really well. If you're concerned about grass injury, then you go to something like maybe a Vastland Milestone. And again, here's your aquatic mix that you could use. We also make a product called ClearCast, which I haven't talked about here. It's actually sold through CPro, an aquatic company. If you're doing things like Japanese stiltgrass control, it can work really well and has a full aquatic label. So really good for some of your riparian areas. So this is just to demonstrate the selectivity you can get with some of these mixes. So this is a Garlon 3A Detail Escort mix, but you can see what they sprayed. They left everything else alone. So they left the ferns, everything else alone. So you can be really, really selective with these types of mixes. But again, this is pretty light density, and the stems are not very tall. So just to kind of show you longevity of control. So this is a site that was treated back in fall of 2011. So this is 10 days after, this is 9 months after, and this is almost 4 years after. So when somebody asked earlier about the basal bark and how long it takes for those stems to fall over, in many cases, up north where you have snowfall, that's going to happen faster. But usually it's going to take a couple years for those things to completely die and then fall over. Again, here's just showing conifer control. This is loblolly pine. So this is more of a southern situation, but white pine could also be substituted there. And then again, this is what I want to leave you in your mind. So here's something that's treated, and then here's what it looks like afterwards. So there was no need to treat over here because on this power line right away, there was nothing there that was going to get up into the power line. But that's where this technique really has a fit. And quite frankly, that's the kind of density in an ideal world you would really want to use this technique on. And just a comment on some of the glyphosate conversations. I know in the northern part of the country, a lot of people don't like to use glyphosate as a brush control product because of the lack of selectivity. But this is a right-of-way that was sprayed with a backpack crew, and this is what it looks like a month after. And yeah, it looks like they took out a lot of things, but I would defy anyone to tell me a year and a half later that was sprayed with glyphosate and Arsenal based on what has come back. So, there are a lot of products that are grass selective, for example, but at the end of the day, if you're using selective placement, this is the kind of result you can get. This is, I think Arsenal and Method is a really, really broad spectrum mix, which I think, at least in the right-of-way arena, is going to become one of the major tank mixes of choice. Here's just a shot of how selective you can be with these mixes. This also has some escort in it. And so just some tips when it comes to these low volume backpack applications. If you're trying to control brush, at least with BASF chemistry and most of the other chemistry out there, we usually recommend methylated seed oil as an adjuvant. You're going to get the best uptake. It's going to get through the cuticle of some of these waxy species, and you're going to get the best control. Again, these low volume applications are best in short, light density brush. And if you're trying to go for conifer control, generally earlier in the summer is going to be better than later. If you go to our website, there's a whole presentation on different application techniques. And again, it's focused on right-of-way work, but there's a chart in there that shows all of the different application techniques, where to use them, what's the relative cost, and what's the relative efficiency and effectiveness. And you might find that interesting as you're trying to learn more about some of these different application techniques. And it's really, really important for any of these applications, know the site you're on, use the appropriate technique. And in some cases, that's going to be multiple techniques. Use the appropriate herbicides, make sure you're calibrating your equipment. I'll just show just a quick story. There was some customers out in California that were trying to treat Phragmites, and they were using syringes because they were concerned about the toxicity of the herbicides, and they were using the Habitat, which is our another formulation of Arsenal, and they ended up using over 100 times the maximum use rate on the label, thinking they were trying to be really, really careful. They would have been much better off doing a foliar application there that would have got better control, and they certainly wouldn't have violated the label. So make sure you're always reading and follow the label directions. And Stephen's point about some of these basal treatments and going over the maximum label rate, that can happen very easily. So here's my contact information. We've got some really, really good information on our website in the multimedia area, and just testimonials and how-to information on a lot of these different subjects. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions if there are any.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think what we'll do for the sake of time is we'll save those questions for later on, and we'll now turn it over to Jason Belcher. Jason, if you want to share your screen, I'll introduce you. He's going to focus on some of the Hack-and-squirt and stem injection methods, highlighting some of these and with some of the products that are used for Bayer. Take it away, Jason.
All right, thanks, Mark. Appreciate everybody being here today and the opportunity to speak to you. My name is Jason Belcher. I cover the eastern U.S. for Bayer and vegetation management, forestry, and range and pasture. I'm the stewardship and development manager here, and I'm actually told I cover from South Florida all the way up to Wisconsin, Minnesota area, and including the Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. But so far, I haven't really gotten them to allow me to go down there and do much work for some reason. So I'm not sure that I'm really covering that, but I'm going to touch back on Hack-and-squirt applications. Dr. Enloe talked about that, and then just talk about some products I think will be of interest to you in fighting some of these invasive species you have. And it advanced. All right, here we go. So when we talk about Hack-and-squirt, Dr. Enloe again talked about that, but it's basically in its I think purest form using a hatchet or machete. Those are the two tools you see most often used. A squirt bottle, and you make your incision into that cambium of the tree, and typically that's going to be about a 45-degree angle, and you want to make kind of a cup there, put about a ml of solution in there, and then it'll stay there and give you control of that tree. Now, as Dr. Enloe pointed out, these can vary. I have seen some that are very close to 1 ml per trigger pull, but others are more than 5 mils, and so you can get some of that material running out of that cut, and that's definitely something we want to avoid. I think a lot of times we see it used on larger trees. I like to use it on 4 inches or larger trees. Certainly when you get above this limit, you would use basal bark applications on. I think this has a good fit. Can be done any time of year, certainly, but as Dr. Enloe mentioned, the spring treatments generally are going to be poor just because of that heavy sap flow. And also he mentioned, we're going to leave, if you have good effective control, you're going to leave those trees standing as they die. And that's going to result in, it's going to look bad. It's going to be a safety concern, as he brought up. But on the flip side of that, if it is in an area that you can leave it standing, it does provide some benefit to the wildlife in the cavity nesting birds and wood boring bees and insects. So there's a give and take there. And I think you just have to have, have a good awareness of the site that you're doing it in. As I said, it's a very selective treatment method. And in fact, it's on my little property here where I'm fighting Iliagnus and calorie pear. It's what I've used more than anything else. It's very easy to do, fairly quick. And as I said, very selective. And so you don't have a lot of, chance to impact off-target species as you do with the foliar application sometimes, or even basal bark, which we'll hear about in just a minute. So that's one of the reasons I like a lot. Again, you don't need a lot of equipment. A hatchet and a squirt bottle is really all you need. And for, these times where you might have a volunteer group that comes to help clean up a park or a natural area, I think you can get a lot done in a little bit of time, and everybody can bring their own equipment and get that done. And of course, you might not want to send untrained people out with, a Mazapir or method, but for other things, you might be able to. And of course, I say if they can go out and they can work a chainsaw and a bush axe, you can probably train them to use the herbicides, very effectively. A slide I powdered from one of Dr. Enloe's talks, just showing, and he brought this picture up a while ago, but just kind of shows you want to get into that sapwood, into the cambium and sapwood of that tree. You don't really want to get into that heartwood or that dead wood. Getting the herbicide there, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to bring any benefit. So you really want to keep it in that living tissue there, just to get that up and down the plant for better control. So as you look at the labels, and I pulled a couple off here, you'll see sometimes, the labels saying you need overlapping cuts. So you basically have the edge of each hack touching one another, as you see in the top picture there. Or you may even have them saying, you want them evenly spaced out once every 2 or 3 inches, depending on, what label you have. And so I pulled a couple off. The top one is actually Arsenal. And you can see they tell you to use 1 ml of solution for every, 1 injection for every 3 inches, and put a ml in there. And then you go below that and you see the Vaseline label says a half of undiluted Vaseline or 1 milliliter of diluted solution in that pocket, and they want it overlap, kind of like what we talked about at the top. So, you do get a good bit of direction on these labels about how to do it. Just need to make sure and read that label again, follow the label, and follow the instruction it gives you, and you'll end up with a pretty good result, I believe. I mentioned earlier, you don't want to over apply. You don't want to get material running out of these hacks, because again, that's when we get into off-target injury issues, especially when you're using a product like picloram or method, which is aminocyclopyrachlor or Mazapir. And so, when you do that and you get a big rainfall, that material is going to wash off into the root zone of any trees or brush species that may be nearby. And this is actually a picture of some basal bark work we've done in the past, looking at calorie pear, looking at some method mixes. As Dr. Enloe mentioned, it is very hard on conifer species, and this is a loblolly pine. You can see where we had about a 3-inch rain after this was treated, unfortunately. Sometimes you can't control the weather in those summer thunder showers here in the South, and we did get some off-target injury. And you can get this from Hack-and-squirt applications too, if you get that material running down and getting in the root zone, depending on what species you have nearby. So you just have to have good stewardship and make sure that you're putting out the correct amount, that you don't get that material running out of those cuts. So just a little bit on another, what I call a spin on Hack-and-squirt, and drill and veil certainly is nothing new. I believe Dr. Chris Evans mentioned earlier in one of his talks. But generally, this is using a cordless drill, using a bit, I say about a 1/4 inch drill bit. It can be 7/16. I've seen people use bigger and smaller, but basically what you want to do is use it to drill in and make that cut or incision in, just like you would with a hatchet or machete. You want to treat into the sapwood of that tree, and then get about a ml of solution in there to treat it. And I think this is a very effective method on larger tree species, or as Dr. Enloe said, some of these species that start to get that thicker bark. I've done this, quite a while, and you get some of these very corky bark species or thicker bark species, and you have to really put a beating on it with a hatchet or machete to kind of get it into that, in that cambium layer where you want it. And certainly with the drill, you can do that much easier. I think it's a little bit easier on the arm. If you've got quite a few stems to treat, it certainly beats you up a lot less than swinging a hatchet or a machete. The limitation on that, however, is, you're going to be limited by how long that battery pack goes. And so if you've got a lot of stems to treat, you may need an extra battery, or if you've got a lot of individuals out there, each one is going to need to bring their own. probably to get a good bit done. So there's limitation there. And I think one of the things that I've seen when I've seen this done in the past, there is a tendency for people to drill too deep in the tree, and you kind of get in again that dead wood. And again, that's not what we want to do. We want to keep in that living area so that we get it translocated throughout the plant. So those are a couple considerations, when you're using something like that. But certainly, I think, if you don't have a lot and you got a good battery, it's a very, very nice way to get things done versus going out and hacking a lot of trees. So with some of the work we've done, we obviously are doing 10 stems or 10 trees or something like that, and we'll use syringes to put in the mill into that hole. And of course, when you're talking about a hole that's a quarter, say, to 7/16 of an inch, squirt bottle is going to be a little bit problematic because again, there's much more likelihood of you getting that material running down the outside of the tree, and of course we do want to avoid that. So you may need something a little bit more precise in the application there. I kind of threw the picture on the right in. This was one of our applicators. I'm not going to say who it was, but he actually had a little bit of that off-target injury in some of his work, and so he took the tops of golf course tees. He's a big golfer, and he said, "Oh, this will fit in the hole very well." And so he actually plugged the hole up with golf course tees to keep the rain from moving anything out. But as I said, you may need a little bit more precise applicator, and I just pulled this off the web. It's a veterinary applicator or doser. You can do it like 1 to 5 mils. You can get them at various things. But I have seen these rigged up with a bladder, like for example, a bladder that a runner might use, or a jogger that has a tube that comes around that you can drink out of while you're running or hiking. And those have been kind of retrofitted to fit on the top of these, so that you can put your herbicide solution in the bladder, and then of course you have to be sure and label that properly because you don't want anybody drinking out of it, of course. But and that's been very effective. These are not cheap. They are, of course, much more expensive than a little plastic squirt bottle, and so there is consideration there. But again, if you have the setup for it, it is a very precise and method of application to do, rather than going with a machete and hatchet if you can do it. So just a couple quick shots on some work that's been done. This is down in Dr. Enloe's area in Florida, South Florida Water Management District, with Mike Terry is the guy here. And this is an area, I think it was 900 plus acres, give or take, and he was really fighting Chinese tallow tree. And he used method 65% solution to take those down. You can see the tree on the left. He's standing next to a tallow tree there, and he got great results in the work he did there. And he also treated a species they had there called bishopwood on the right, and you can see that's a large multi-stem tree. We went and looked at this the season after he had treated, and the top of this tree was pretty much dead. Some of the roots were still alive, some were dead, but I haven't circled back with him to see. But again, as Dr. Enloe said, method is a very powerful herbicide, and we kind of have a saying, if you can get it into the plant, we can just about kill it. So again, a very effective method of working. So just a quick product update. I've mentioned Method 240SL. Two others that we've done a good bit of work up in the northern part of, especially with Japanese stiltgrass in the northern part of the country. Esplanade and Esplanade Sure. We started looking at last year, really, with that last one there. Method I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Dr. Enloe mentioned it. But again, selective weeding rates are 4 to 8 ounces. If you go to brush rates, it's generally 12 to 18 or 1/4% volume to volume. But again, it's very injurious on conifer species, and so you have to be aware of the site you're going on. But again, it's not the boogeyman. We work with picloram, we work with Arsenal, and so we know what these herbicides will do. And it's got a little bit of a bad rap because, again, DuPont trying to put it into that turf grass market. You had a lot of applicators with hoses out applying over root zones, and so we did get a lot of tree kill. But again, we've got a lot of thousands and thousands of acres treated on utility and roadside right-of-ways without really any issues to speak of, at least no more than any other herbicide. So again, it's not the boogeyman. You just have to be aware of what's going on and use good stewardship practices when you use it. Some of the slides I'm going to show, this is, I believe every one of these is Dr. Renz's work. This is the first from 2017 on wild parsnip. And you look at the picture on the right, we did a great job controlling wild parsnip. This is basically a year after, 4 ounces, and you can see on the left the taller stalks there that were left that were untreated, and so it did a very nice job there. In 2018, he did some work on yellow tansy, and again did very, very good job there. And he found that 8 ounces was, at least of the rates we tested, 4, 8, and 12, that method did a really good job at 8 ounces. 4 was pretty good, but not quite as up to snuff, and so it's probably somewhere in between those two. But it did a very nice job of controlling that species as well. This is actually a highway interchange. And then Dr. Renz has also done some work with bush honeysuckle and looking at method for that. And I just threw a picture of a 1/4% here, and you can see it did a nice job almost a year after controlling that bush honeysuckle. So again, I think it has a pretty good fit in the northern states on a lot of those invasives up there. Moving to Esplanade and Esplanade Sure. Trying not to run over my time very much here. Both of these products contain indaziflam. The 200 SC is indaziflam by itself. It's a pre-emergent herbicide. It's a CBI, or cellulose biosynthesis inhibitor. Has a very long residual. Here in the East, we've tried to get applicators moved to fall applications because they can put it down and then still get pre-emergence control of annual grasses and broadleaves that are germinating during the spring. The rates are 3.5 to 7 ounces. Esplanade Sure also contains indaziflam and is a dry formulation that contains rimsulfuron, which is an ALS herbicide. And that kind of gives us that pre and post control to go along with what we get with indaziflam and Esplanade. And so what we see sometimes is people get Esplanade out really close to when seeds are germinating. And so we miss those seeds that might have already started, but maybe not emerged, or they've just emerged. And we miss those because, again, we don't have any activity really on things that are established. By putting rimsulfuron in, we get a little bit of that post activity. And so it helps us out there. Most of the work, again, that's been done with these in the north is on Japanese stiltgrass. Just a couple of slides here from Chris Evans' work. I went to visit Chris last year. He put this out in March, and I went to see him in July. Back whenever I could go visit cooperators and see their work. But again, as you see, he had what we call a research grade site, which is typical of Japanese stiltgrass, completely dominating the understory. And what we've seen with the work we've done is Esplanade does a pretty fair job of controlling pre-emergence, but we do have some misses. It's sometimes inconsistent if we get too close to that germination period. And so what we have is, sometimes inconsistent control. But what we found in Chris's trial anyway, is Esplanade Sure, we really didn't have that. We really got 100% control of stiltgrass, but we also had some forbs that came back in. So it's not like you're getting bare ground when you're going out with this product, but it did do a very good job at 3 ounces. And then at 4.5, again, I think just a really nice shot there of how much stiltgrass is around it and in the back, but really a clean bed there. And so I think it has a good fit, and all these products have a good fit on some of the invasive species. And hopefully in the future, we'll have some more work done with Esplanade and Esplanade Sure on some of these newer emerging grasses that are a problem. So I think that about wraps me up. And if we have time for questions, I'll be glad to take them. If not, I'll stick around until the end.
No, Jason, well, let's go on to the next speaker. Thanks. If you want to unshare your screen, and we'll go on to our last speaker, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Last but not least, I have Scott Flynn with Corteva Agriscience, and Scott's going to talk about some of the other application. We kind of threw everything else to him. We're hoping that he's going to really focus on the basal bark and some of the other cut surface treatments. So Scott, take it away.
All right. Hopefully you all see my my presentation here.
Yep, we can hear and see you. Great.
All right, great. So my name is Scott Flynn. I'm the zonal biology leader for the pasture and land management business in North America. And I got to kind of back clean up here and talk about individual plant treatments for woody plants in terms of low volume basal bark cut stump treatments and dormant stem applications. So as Stephen talked earlier, when we talk about the role of the anatomy of the tree and making applications, we want to bring out that cambium layer in a lot of these, or in these treatments, or what we're focused on. That's the circulatory system of the plant. This is where the lifeblood is at in that plant. So getting that herbicide into that cambium layer, into that vascular system is key to getting good control using these methods. So the first one I'm going to talk about is low volume basal bark treatments, and refer to this as LVB. But usually we're looking at trees with 6 inches in diameter or less. Now I'm gonna put in a little note here for you. If you have a tree that has a thick, corky bark, 4 inches in diameter or less is what we're dealing with. Some species have very thin bark, and so you can take them up to 6 inches, but we have to be very careful when we say up to 6 inches, because some trees, especially here in the in Missouri, hickory, certain oak species, they're going to get kind of thick bark. So just keep that in mind. When we're talking about doing low volume basal bark treatments, we're talking about a 75% oil carrier with 25% Garlon 4 Ultra or Remedy Ultra. You'll see variations on this. You'll see an 80% oil carrier with 25% or 20% Garlon or Remedy, or you may see a 79% oil carrier with 20% Garlon, and you might throw an ounce of something like Milestone in that mix. So there's several recipes here, but one thing I want to stress about a low volume basal treatment is do not confuse it with a conventional basal bark treatment. Conventional basal bark treatment was made to, I mean, it'll say on labels is that it needs to be running off. It kind of almost needs to puddle under the tree. A low volume basal application is meant to put a light coat on the bark, just enough to wet the bark, but not enough to run off. And this is really important. I've taken a few licks on the chin over the years in presentations where people come to me and they say, you know what, we've gone and used low volume basal bark treatments with Remedy Ultra, and we're killing species at 10 and 15%. That's great, but your application technique is something you probably need to look at in reference to that. Low volume basal techniques are made for those backpack crews that have to go on these long walks to treat stems, and we don't need them coming back or having to have a nurse tank close to them all the whole time. So that high herbicide volume in that mixture is meant to put a very light coat on there, so we're not going back and having to refill constantly. So that's something I want to stress about low volume basal bark applications versus conventional basal bark applications. So in a low volume basal treatment, it's one of the more versatile methods of IPT. It is labor intensive compared to some of the other methods such as foliar. But the thing is you can conduct this any time of the year as long as that bark is not frozen or that base is not snow covered. And I would even say in there, if the bark is really saturated, maybe a heavy rain, that could be an issue, but usually it's not soaked in enough to keep you from treating it. I talked to you just a few seconds ago about the diameter of the tree needing to be 6 inches or less, and we also need to be very cognizant of the type of bark on a particular species. People get mad at me for saying this, but if you make a proper basal bark application, it's nearly perfect control if we can get that in there. You will have certain species that can tend to put up root suckers. And so we could see that, but as far as the stem that you're treating, it tends to do a very, very good job of controlling that stem. If we run into species that tend to be really bad at root suckering, then adding something in that mix that can increase that control is needed. And a lot of times we're recommending Milestone with those mixes. So let's talk about cut surface treatments. There are two types of cut surface treatments. There's a water-based cut surface treatment, and then there's an oil-based low-volume basal cut surface. And here's the distinction between those two. A water-based is usually using something like Pathway, where we have a Tordon, a water-based Tordon application, or it could also be something like using Method and applying to that that stump that we've cut immediately if possible. All right, so it's usually undiluted, or it can be diluted, but it's usually a very high concentration. We cut that stump, we clean it off, and we immediately treat that cambium layer on top of there. When we have one of the things about, I'll go back to this, water-based treatments is, again, it needs to be done immediately. Minutes count on these. So you cut them, treat them, try to immediately. Now we get into oil-based low-volume basal cut surface. We can apply for maybe several days, even several weeks after cutting that stump. And we're using that recipe I talked about earlier, the 75% oil-based carrier with something like Garlon 4 Ultra or Remedy Ultra as the base. And again, it is applied to that cambium layer. And the outer bark of that and any root flare. So we're not only treating the cambium, we're also treating the remaining outside of that bark if there's any, and if we see any of those root flares that pop up above ground. Here's one of the things that we tell people to watch out for. Trees that are bleeders. So you get into, and I'll give you an example, maples in my neck of the woods. And if you're cutting down a maple early in the season when we have a lot of sap flow coming off, that tree is what we call a bleeder, all right? If you use a water-based herbicide on a bleeder, the herbicide might not get into that stump, and it may get actually pushed out of that stump as that tree begins to, or pushing up that sap flow up. And so sometimes control during a certain period in the spring when we have that sap flow can actually cause water-based applications to fail with certain herbicides. We get into an oil-based treatment that I was talking about earlier. If you do make that application in the spring, if that plant is actually pushing that herbicide out, we still see it go out on the outside of that bark and still soak back into that cambium layer. And so the likelihood of having failures goes on treating that particular stem goes down. When we get into that time frame, those oil-based tend to be a little more favorable just because of the whole issue with trees bleeding. So dormant stem, this is something that you will probably, you might not be that familiar with. And I want to make a distinction here, but dormant stem applications are targeting stems when we have plants that the leaves have dropped, so trees that the leaves have dropped, or up until the time when those leaves are just starting to expand. So we're pretty much talking about treating a naked tree here when it comes to dormant stem applications. And one of the nice things about a dormant stem application is that keeps you from, keeps the public from seeing just a total brownout in leaves. And when we do these types of treatments, we see these stems, they tend not to green back up. So there's not that shock factor when someone drives down the road or walks down a path to see those browned out species. It can be done by a handgun, backpack sprayer, or it could be done with a vehicle bypassing the road and treating those stems. What's key about these dormant stem applications is that we make contact with at least 75% crown, that canopy. So, here in blue dots, this is what we're aiming for. This is almost like doing a low volume basal treatment, except now we are targeting the stems of the plant. Very effective, highly effective treatment if you're set up properly to do it, and you kind of know the ins and outs of it. So just reasons to consider this type of brush control. Extend your brush season out, and we see this with utility companies a lot of times. They bring in migrant workers, they get a good crew together, and then at the end of the season they can't retain them because they don't have anything for them to do, and they let them go, and they lose these trained employees. So this extends the brush season, and it can keep those crews actually working longer. It reduces vegetation management visibility. We're not browning out leaves, we're treating the stem so that they don't actually come back out. It gives us the opportunity to also work in closer proximity to sensitive areas. And again, it comes back to keeping that good crew together. So the ideal scenario on timing for this type of application is 75% of the leaves have dropped off the tree until we have 75% leaf expansion in the spring. And the whole goal is to make contact with the stem and not the leaves. So that's kind of the timing on this. It's going to be most effective in areas where we have a number of stems that's too great to go in and do individual plant treatments, and where that average stem diameter is less than 3 inches. So we're talking about shorter brush that has a smaller stem. And we also need to make sure that we are capable of treating up to 75% of that crown. So just to recap, comparison of these applications by month, if we look at cut stump applications, we have a little window in there, March, April, maybe even into May, where we have to be careful about these trees that are bleeders. When we talk about basal cut stump and basal bark treatment, those can go year-round, given the nature of that application, as long as we don't have those factors such as a frozen bark or a bark that's so saturated the oil just simply won't sink in. And then we have dormant stem applications. That's all about making contact with the crown, those stems. And so having leaves dropped, but before the leaves have expanded out enough to prevent contact with those stems is really key. If you have any other questions or you want to talk about these applications or learn more about these application methods, you can go to Corteva's land man. Just do a search for Corteva Land Management, and our website will pop up. And I've also included the website here if you would rather copy that down. So with that, Mark, that's the end of my presentation.
Great, thank you, Scott. And thanks again to Jim and Jason. We do have until 12:10 for Q&A. So if you want to stop sharing your screen, Scott, and we can pull up all the presenters. I have a long list of questions, as you can imagine, that people want to ask us of. Okay, so I'll try and direct these to individuals. I think this first one is going to go to you, Jason, and then if not, probably Stephen. I recall hearing a talk about the difficulty of getting Hack-and-squirt right on Ailanthus. Is that correct? And are there caveats to using a drill and fill on it, or is that effective on Ailanthus?
I'll defer to Stephen. He's probably treated a lot more Ailanthus than I have.
Stephen? You're muted, Stephen.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so straight up Hack-and-squirt on Ailanthus, it can be challenging. It can, you can often have multi-stemmed individuals. I know that triclopyr amine as a Hack-and-squirt approach has often definitely released some sprouts at the base of Ailanthus and frustrated a lot of people who have sort of gotten away from Hack-and-squirt in that case. We don't have a lot of good data on aminocyclopyrachlor with reduced Hack-and-squirt at this point. Milestone, I know, is not working as direct Hack-and-squirt very well in my experience. So yeah, there are some problems with it, but I have not done the drill and fill method for that species.
This is Claire. So I just started well, we have a WIGL channel on the discussion board, and I just kind of tried to tease up the conversation of managing Ailanthus. So if you have experience, I'd encourage you just to use your left menu to drop by the discussion board in that channel.
Okay, so since we're talking about Hack-and-squirt, I'm going to ask this question. On the Hack-and-squirt, is just one hole effective in a 2-inch tree? And then what's the height you want to drill that hole at? So Jason, you want to handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to depend on the material you're using and the species you're treating as far as effectiveness. I know Dr. Enloe's looked at single point applications on large trees and gotten pretty good results on it. For the work we've done, we've actually have some going right now with Chris Evans and Ron Rathbon on sugar maple. And we're comparing, the labeled language, putting the application out, 1 hack for every 2 inches, 3 inches, depending on what the material is. And then comparing method with what our label says, as well as 1 incision, with a hack, or 1 drill hole versus, the drill holes made per language on the label. And it's actually looking really, really good with the drill and fill being more effective than the Hack-and-squirt. And I think part of that probably is going to be due to just having that, you have a better cavity, I think, to hold that herbicide in there versus the hack where you may lose some of it or it may get pushed out by the sap. So, but there's more on that to come, especially with method. As far as the height goes, again, I think with any of these, the lower the better. But, none of us are going to go out and treat, 200 stems in a day and bend over. So I think just doing it at a convenient height, if you can just bend it a little bit and get it down, that would be my advice, because again, it's a lot easier on you and the applicators that are doing it. So, Stephen, anything else you want to add there?
Just, I would agree with that. Logistically or physiologically, getting that herbicide as low to the root collar as possible is great. However, logistically for the applicator, you don't want to be encouraging a practice that's going to cause back injuries with the stooping over. And so, at a comfortable drill height is, I think, where you really need to be for that. And that's what I recommend, because we don't want to go down the injury road. Otherwise, I'd be telling you to drill right there, a couple inches above the soil surface, really.
So another question for Jason, just on method, is this individual said they've been trying it on multiflora rows and haven't had good success with method as a foliar spray. And so they just want to know, what species do you not recommend method for that are common? I know that's a tough question to answer.
It is. It is. Well, there's, I would like to say that, I can make a lot of recommendations on Hack-and-squirt on species, but the truth is we've only done a few, and a lot of those have been more invasive. It is not a very effective herbicide on the rose species, multiflora rose, and others that we see more here in the South too. But I would not expect it. That general family, we tend to be very weak on.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've had some questions about trainings and pesticide applicators, and I think I'm just going to state that it's very state specific on your pesticide applicator training and tests, but all of us that you can see train people and do courses like these. So really seek out for these courses. Industry has courses, extension has courses, universities and others. So the key is you get training. And if you need help, contact MIPIN, contact us, and we can contact industry and we can help with that. There's some questions about calibration and the challenges. And I don't think any of us want to talk about math. And so we're just going to say it's hard and get help.
What's the question, Mark?
Oh, you're saying that when we calibrate our backpack sprayers, we always come out near 60 gallons per acre. That seems unrealistic. Is there a better way to calibrate? And, you just got to go out and do it and practice it. I would say 60 gallons, if for a foliar treatment, is not that unrealistic. When we do our research trials, we're usually in the 40 to 50 range. So it's just a challenge and you need to practice it, right, Stephen?
Yeah, let me add something to that. So woody shrubs increase the three-dimensional nature of your application. That's inevitably always going to increase your application volume as opposed to a quick brush across the top of the shrub. We do know that you need to get the sides of the shrub in for specific types of treatments, and that's always going to up your volumes. One thing you might consider, I don't know if it's an adjustable cone nozzle on there or exactly if you have a flat fan kind of narrow angle nozzle. If you've gone with a flat fan, you might drop down a nozzle tip size on those. If it's an adjustable cone, you're a little bit more limited on that, lowering the pressure just a little bit, sort of speeding up, just working on that 1/128th method several times. The 1/128th method of calibration for backpacks is really the best way I've found to get really comfortable. And if you really are wanting to push it down and get below 60, then that's the way I would go about it.
Yeah, I also would add on calibration of any of these things, go to the site that you're treating and calibrate there. Don't do it on a parking lot or something like we would normally show. That will help you a lot.
Train your employees on the parking lot the very first time, then take them to the field. And then all calibrations after that, do it on the site.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. This next question, Scott, is for you. They're talking about treating small stems via basal bark, and they're worried about the amount of herbicide missing the stem. So you can imagine they're spraying a pencil diameter and they're getting off spray. And they're concerned that that's going to depress the recovery of native or planted species. So you have any suggestions how they can limit that off target with those small stems?
Sure. One thing in particular is, Stephen was talking about adjustable cone tip nozzles. The one I prefer to use is a T-Jet 5500, and they make a varying size orifice for those. They make an X, which tends to make more of a cone, and they make a Y, which tends to make it's a slightly different pattern from what I've seen. But having a nozzle that you can adjust the cone size down so that you're not having this massive spray miss is key. And the other thing is keeping your pressure very low. Rarely will I ever use a low volume basal wand over 20-25%. I have just enough pressure to create a cone, but not enough to just cause the atomization. The other thing is that crooked tip that Stephen showed earlier. having that and angling that up so you're going more down the side of the tree and not spraying into the tree is also key to keep that ring of death from occurring. You're on mute, Mark.
Yeah, no, I'm muted. Anyone else have anything to add? I think that was really good advice, Scott.
The only thing I would add is, any one of these techniques may not fit every situation. So a little bit of flexibility and be prepared with a, with a second sprayer that might be able to cover some of those smaller stems. If they had foliage on them, you might do it as a fuller application. There might be some situations where you have to go to a cut stump if you're, worried about that situation. So just be prepared with multiple applications, I think, is a good rule of thumb.
One last thing, if you are hell bent on using the basal bark application on those super teeny tiny stems, I've almost gone to a unbelievably low pressure, get that adjustable cone nozzle much closer to a straight stream and literally hold it up against the stem itself and barely squeeze that trigger, and you will immediately see a release of spray, and you'll begin to see that spray run down the stem and begin to dribble. And it's almost like it's like the touch, just barely touch the wand to the stem, barely pull the trigger, and you will see spray come down it. And that is usually going to be enough because the stem will wrap, the spray will wrap around those smooth stems that are that small. And you can greatly reduce the total application volume that way. It's just super labor intensive and meticulous.
Yeah, so if you're concerned about off-target issues and you have the time to do it, the drizzle or dribble method is a good option. Thank you. Jim, this is for you. This is about Eastern red cedar. They're interested in how effective detail is on Eastern red cedar. If you have any data to provide, since you said it does have some conifer activity.
It's very effective on Eastern red cedar. It's probably one of the only uses or only species you would treat with detail by itself. I still like to put some escort with it. I think those two work very well. It's the rule of thumb with Eastern red cedar, though, is you need to make sure that you have enough pressure to get inside the outer needles. You can't just go over the top and get Eastern red cedar. So typically it's more done with a handgun than a backpack, so that you get enough pressure to get those needles all the way down towards the stem itself.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. Now we're turning to bittersweet. So this comment is saying, has anyone ever treated bittersweet with triclopyr? They've observed resprouting when they're using a cut stump treatment. And they're saying, which is better, cut stump versus basal bark? I did check our fact sheet. I haven't treated it, but we did rate the cut surface as a mediocre for control, or decent, but not great. I don't know if, Scott, you have data on bittersweet, or if anyone else does that they'd like to share their experiences.
Chris Evans and we treated an area of bittersweet and autumn olive in southern Illinois a few years ago. And the difficult thing about treating bittersweet is that you can have a stem go underground and then come back up 5-6 feet over there. And so you have to ask yourself, am I treating a stem here that has multiple stems coming up and in different places, or am I just treating a single one? So for that purpose, I kind of like low volume basal and going in and just treating everything that I can find in terms of those stems. We had really good success with it. The other thing that we did, triclopyr does not move as rapidly through a plant as something like picloram or imazapyr or aminocyclopyrrochlor. It tends to stay localized in the area. So if you have things that tend to root sucker, they don't do as well. And so in those cases, putting something in that translocates well in that basal application is probably key to getting better control. So as a standalone method of using low volume basal with your triclopyr butyl ester such as Remedy and Garlon 4, I really think I would like to have something in there that translocates throughout that plant a little better, so that if you do have those stems that are jetting up in other areas, we're getting control of them, or getting better control of them.
Yeah, so that brings up a key issue that we have problems with, particularly in our oak savannas, is root grafting. And that's one of the reasons why we don't use things like picloram, because, you know, we can kill our bush honeysuckle and kill a 300-year-old oak tree at the same time. And so that's one of the benefits of triclopyr. Maybe could you guys talk about how to deal with this root grafting issue and approaches? I know that's a real challenge, but that's often why in Wisconsin, we recommend things that don't translocate super well because of that concern, particularly in those oak woodland setting.
I can speak to the imazapyr component. And the way I describe it is it can be done safely, putting a small amount, you know, use the lower rates of imazapyr, but you don't want to get greedy in the stems that you're treating. In other words, instead of treating every stem in one season, if you have the flexibility to spread it out over 3 seasons, just so that you're lowering that amount of imazapyr that could translocate to a desirable through root grafts, then you can be pretty successful with it. But a lot of people can't wait that long, you know, to get an area treated.
From a morphological or anatomical perspective, a lot of researchers have gone out looking for interspecific root grafting between different species. And the data they keep coming back with is it's not really happening. So that true root grafting of the actual phloem, combining fully between 2 totally different species is not really happening in nature. And however, of course, between the same species, you better believe it. So 2 oak trees of the same species root graft like crazy. And so there's kind of a consensus on the body of literature that's out there that that's what's going on. One of the things that I add into the issue of herbicide flashback is, of course, root exudation or passive loss through dying roots. We know that happens with imazapyr, and I'm very confident it's going to happen with aminocyclopyrrochlor, possibly aminopyrrolate in some cases too. Right now with triclopyr, we are currently conducting flashback studies looking at non-target damage to native woody species surrounding target treated species with basal bark applications. And we are not seeing a whole lot of non-target damage in terms of from any type of root exudation using activated charcoal type approaches. So it's kind of neat to see that. I don't think it's going to be quite as big of an issue with triclopyr, and I think Scott already provided some physiologic explanation for that, and I'm going to agree with him on that. So I think there's a safety factor that comes into play by using triclopyr. There may be some compromise on control, but it may be a safer way to go.
So I've done some work with the Missouri Walnut Council and some tree farmers here in Missouri, and we've gone out on farm and conducted some research just with a triclopyr butyl ester using Garlon 4 Ultra in our case. And we've even cut, you have 2 stems, large stems coming out of the same stump, and we have treated one side and not treated the other, and have never seen any issue actually translocating to the other side. And that's one of the beauties about triclopyr. We use it to chemically side trim on roadsides because it does not tend to translocate well enough. It tends to kill just one side of the tree. And so while it can be a negative with triclopyr not getting good coverage in situations like this, it tends to be a benefit because it gives us a scalpel instead of a chainsaw to control an area. So that's certainly one of the benefits to it. We just don't see that movement via root grafting or in the soil when we do a proper application.
Okay, being in the upper north, we had to have this question, and so be prepared for this. This is the last question that we'll deal with. Someone told me recently they do cut stump and use 41% glyphosate diluted with antifreeze to extend the treatment through the winter, so the solution doesn't freeze. Can you guys address this issue? Is it good, bad, or whatever? So Scott, go ahead. You can.
It's all fun and games until you have an animal come up and lick the stump.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually even a more appropriate, so it's off label, so you can't legally do it. But what Scott brings up is probably the most pertinent point is glyphosate is toxic to many animals. I'm not glyphosate, I'm sorry, the
Antifreeze.
antifreezes. Yeah. So that's a big concern. So it's just a no-no, I think. I don't know. Do you guys have other approaches with dealing with these cold weather applications, how to prevent equipment and water from freezing? Stephen, you're in Florida, so you get a pass on this one.
I'm not qualified to answer that question anymore. I would ask though, from the distributor perspective on the adjuvant side of things, is there a specific adjuvant that there's data for that lowers the freezing point of the solution? And glyphosate alone is going to lower the freezing point, some I suspect, just being the solute component of it.
Yeah, I know what we deal with in our some of our distributors is we can get that freezing point down into the 20s or so, but when it's in the teens and single digits, it's going to freeze unless you put antifreeze in. So that's really the struggle that I know people have issues with.
I use bark oil blue LT, which is the low temperature bark oil. And still, it doesn't get you down low enough for those crazy people in the north that live in negative temperatures. Again, maybe the 20s mark. I'm with you.
Right. Okay, well, we're at 12:10, so I want to thank everyone for hanging on. Again, if you scroll all the way down to the event Mobi, you'll see an evaluation. Please take that. And again, I'd really like to personally thank all my speakers, Scott, Stephen, Jim, and Jason. I really appreciate your time and energy sticking with us today and talking about this critical issue.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Absolutely. Good to be here.
Those are a lot of questions, and you did a fantastic job with them. So thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
I just ended the stream. So we had about, I think it was 164 people.
Cool.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Holy smokes.
Yeah, we knew this was going to be like super popular because we get a lot of people that always ask questions about this. So this was great. This was perfect.
Well, you guys nailed those technical details on the techniques really well. I'm very grateful I didn't get into those things. So that actually seemed like it worked out really well between.
Oh, Feb's 174.
Yeah, this is one of the areas that there aren't a lot of black and white answers, and there's a lot of questions. So I think this is a great area to have those kinds of discussions because it's not easy.
Well, what we get is, I'll give you a very specific example. We get someone that works at DNR and they're managing a property and there's buckthorn on it. So they write for a contractor to come in and they say, we want you to basal bark all of this. And, there's, literally thousands of stems per acre. And, the contractor's like, I don't want to basal bark this. This is ridiculous. But the DNR biologist doesn't understand that they just are told basal bark's the way to go. And so things like this really can educate them, like the slide, Stephen, you showed in your guys' advice, that you need to think about this. And that's really who I view as one of the main targets, because they're writing these contracts. The contractors, if they're good, they know the right techniques. It's really teaching them to write a correct contract.
Mark, we are.
People just don't have enough tools in the toolbox.
No.
And that's what we run into here.
Do any of you see a lot of the mulching machines on invasive projects now?
Oh yeah.
To me, that might be, at the end of the day, all things considered, maybe the best option, and then hit it when it resprouts. I mean, that seems like the right thing to do.
Yeah, these forestry mowers, I think those are the key. And we're actually going to probably do some stuff if any of you guys are interested. Because I don't know, is there any data on I know people want to use these forestry mowers and then spray right after, but I never see any data on that.
Cut stubble work, yeah.
So Jim Hanula with the USDA Forest Service did some really great work on Chinese privet that he published, where they were coming in on these really big plots and mowing them down. And what they found out was they couldn't find the stumps, number one, right, if they tried to do it right after. And then number two, those machines tend to fracture stumps quite a bit, and you don't get a good kill with a cut stump treatment on a broken stump. So I'd never recommend that now.
So no, not at all. Okay.
Well, one of the things that I think is when I first started with DuPont, Mark Rice, who covers the Northeast, and then Randy Denhart, also, Mark covers up in your area. And they love putting down well, I would say the old streamline, because that's where, or viewpoint, because that's where it really started. But they love when they go in and mow and they leave, a 4-inch tall stem there. And of course, a lot of this stuff is smaller stem things, but they really enjoyed going out. They said it worked pretty well. Now, again, it's not like going out and treating, when it's 4 feet tall and getting good coverage, but it gives the applicator a little bit wider window, maybe to go in there and treat. But for us, and we tried that in the South, and we never have been able to get that to work with any herbicide. So, and again, not the Jim or Scott have other experience, but for me, it's never really worked very well, and I've never been impressed with it. But to what Randy said is, he said, look, they know it's not going to be 100%, but buys them time. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, that's, if it's working for them, I mean, it's not like it's prohibited on the label. So
I pushed back on them too, but it's if you look at it as stem density reduction, yes, you do get that, but it's not nearly the level of control you would get with some other techniques.
Right.
I always explain to people like this. I have a lot of farmers that mow, and I say, if you mow down a tree 8 foot tall, you've got an 8-foot tree tall root mass under the ground, and you're trying to get enough herbicide into this sapling coming back the next year to kill that root. And I said, it just doesn't happen. I said, you commit yourself to 2 or 3 years of making those applications when you go through and mow it. So when they run a feed pond through a DNR project here, I just cringe. And Stephen, back to your point, I was working with NRCS. They were calling me to consult me on a project, but they had gone in and done cut stump applications with Garlon or with Remedy Ultra, and they were just having massive root sprouts. One of the things that I picked up on is that they were going through. They were going through and they were cutting them with a skid steer. Those skid steers, they hit those stumps and they knock the bark off the side of them, and that's the first place that thing is going to come back on. So, if I'd had more time, I would have got into the issues with equipment when you're doing that type of
the drum headers that we use in the Southeast on the skid steers. They literally are almost cultivating the top inch of soil with those things. They're not leaving 4-inch clean stems. So they want park-like conditions where no ankle breaker 4-inch stumps, and they are taking those suckers all the way down.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm going to get some lunch and have a beer.
Great idea.
Hey, again, thanks for a wonderful conference. We'll share the evaluations when they come back, but I'm sure they'll be excellent. And again, thank you all for being a part of this.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Hey, you all have a great weekend.
The panel discussions are a whole lot easier with highly technical experts like you as co-panelists. It makes it a whole lot more fun. So
I'm just standing on Bill Klein's shoulders, Stephen.